Now, these are different kinds of people following the same Jesus, the same words in different languages. And as we've shared, that's true for us as well. This is a series about the disciples, but it's also a series about us, about different groups of people seeking to follow the same Jesus, and what we find often at those intersections of our differences and discipleship. So we've looked at a couple of these guys already. I want to start this morning by showing you kind of the full list here. This is the account of Jesus calling the disciples in Luke 6. This is Luke's version of who and how these 12 people are. This is Luke 6 and verse 12. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray, and Jesus spent the night praying to God. When morning came, Jesus called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. The word apostles means sent. Simon, whom he named Peter, Peter's brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, who Tiana shared about last week, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, and of course, Judas, our friend, not Iscariot, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. The first week of this series, we spent some time talking about Jesus calls 12 guys, and half of them have the same name. Jesus calls 2 Simons, 2 Jameses, and 2 Judases. Now, the 2 Judases in this text get the same, they both get a distinction. There is, of course, Judas Iscariot, and if you're the other guy, you want to be something else, right? The Gospel of John calls Judas Iscariot Judas, not Judas Iscariot. Here he gets the delightful distinction of, his dad's name is James. That's much nicer. That's much better. So the 2 Judases are distinguished in that way. The 2 Jameses, you see James, son of Alphaeus, is there. Historically, we've come to call this guy James the Lesser, which is really unfortunate for that James. We'll talk about him next week. That's because the other James is one of Jesus' inner circle, Peter, James, and John. So we've got James in the inner circle, James, son of Alphaeus. And then we've got 2 Simons. Now, Simon Peter, who is the first one listed here, and that makes sense. There's more written about Simon Peter than any of these other guys by far. Peter in any of the Gospels kind of becomes, I would argue in a sense, he's kind of our eyes and ears walking through this story, less in the Gospel of John maybe, but Peter is the one who will take the lead and kind of the personification of here's a person who's trying to follow Jesus Christ and not always getting it exactly right, or a person who thinks they're a little bit smarter than they actually are. So if you've got 2 Simons, but one of them is in fact Peter, the most famous, the most written about disciple, it would be easy for the text here to say Simon Peter and Simon, not Simon Peter, right? Or just Simon Peter and Simon, the other guy. But the distinction we get here is that the other Simon is also called the Zealot, Simon the Zealot. And this distinction is really all we got for him. It would be easy for them to just kind of make a simple distinction like James, son of Alphaeus, and then move on, because we really don't have any other stories or any other contextual clues or any of that stuff about the specificities of Simon the Zealot and how he deals with Jesus. But in the first century, when we say Simon who's called the Zealot, chances are that doesn't just mean that he's like Simon the Passionate, right? Or Simon prone to yell at referees, right? A few of us are Simon the Zealot this morning, perhaps. So there's this sense that when we see Simon who's called the Zealot with a capital Z, that we're talking about something more than just kind of his emotions. In the first century, among the Jewish people in Israel and around Jesus, in the first century, there were 4 groups or kind of 4 distinctions of Jewish people in that area. The one we hear the most about by far is the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees are a group of Jews living in that area where Jesus comes into contact with them often. We hear about the Pharisees almost 100 times in the New Testament. The Pharisees wielded power and influence through the synagogues, through local congregations. So the Pharisees weren't just in Jerusalem in one centralized place. The Pharisees had for lack of a better word, a church, a place in all kinds of different areas. And the Pharisees obviously believed in very strict interpretations of the Old Testament, strict interpretations of the Hebrew Bible. Jesus is going to come into conflict with these guys often, and probably to this degree where when we see the word Pharisee, it's something we don't want to be, right? It's a group of people that are at odds with Jesus. Along with the Pharisees, you also had a group called the Sadducees. The Sadducees, if the Pharisees wielded power and influence through the synagogue, the Sadducees wielded power and influence through the temple in Jerusalem, and also through the Sanhedrin, the ruling council. The Sadducees had this long historical connection to the priests and really ran things in the temple. So it was a less of an everyday interaction with people like the Pharisees, but more of to practice your religion, to do these things, you had to go through these guys. Sadducees, instead of believing in the entire Old Testament, believed in just the first 5 books of the Bible, in just the Torah, in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so because of that, they ran into conflict with Jesus for some other reasons, primarily being that they did not believe in resurrection, because there is no resurrection, no evidence of resurrection in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You want to hear a really terrible preacher joke? The way you tell them apart is the Sadducees were so sad, you see, because they didn't believe in resurrection. No, that's too much laughter. That joke is terrible. Pharisees in the synagogues, really, don't go home and tell people I told you that. Pharisees in the synagogue, Sadducees in the temple. Both of these groups would have had some kind of relationship with the Roman Empire. Not because they loved Rome, but because the way things were, Rome had control of that entire region, but had some kind of working relationship that allowed not only the Pharisees and the Sadducees or anybody to still practice their religion, to still essentially be Jewish and not have it be a crime, but the Romans allowed the Pharisees to maintain power and influence in the synagogue and the Sadducees to maintain power and influence through the temple. So there was some kind, we know this, we can see evidence of this when Jesus is being crucified. There's some kind of uncomfortable, uneasy, deal with the devil kind of thing happening between these two groups and the larger Roman Empire at play. And many Jews thought that that was a terrible thing. No Jew would have been like, Rome, amazing, we love them, they're great. But the idea that the religious leaders and establishment had some kind of what I'm going to call tolerance, or some kind of we'll scratch your back if you scratch our back, many Jewish people in the first century would have looked at that and thought that was corrupt and blasphemous. People who really leaned into that typically tended to fall into 2 groups. There's a group called the Essenes, who looked at that establishment and that system and said, this is corrupt. This is blasphemous. This is no good. And what the Essenes believed in large part was, we got to get out of here. They withdrew themselves into wilderness and isolated places. There's some people who think John the Baptist, who kind of dresses and talks a little like a crazy person who's been away from civilization for a minute, might have been hanging out in some Essene communities. They believed that God's judgment was near. For obvious reasons, the people of God are in collusion with a pagan government and all that good stuff. And they thought to themselves, let's get out of here. Let's remove ourselves. Let's go hide in the wilderness. Maybe not hide, but let's remove ourselves to the wilderness. God's going to judge all this, and we don't want to be there when it happens, right? So let's remove ourselves. Let's study the Torah in our own kinds of ways and community. This world is wicked and corrupt. We need to step back and let God take care of it. Make sense? But another group of people who would have thought that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all that establishment was corrupt, but did not think stepping back was the thing to do, were the Zealots. And the Zealots, very different than the Essenes, instead of looking at all that and saying this is corrupt and stepping back and saying God's going to take care of all this, let's get out of here, the Zealots would have stepped forward and said this system is corrupt and we need to take it down in any and all means that we can. We really see the fullness of this later after Jesus' time. The Zealots are heavily involved in the violence that escalates that will ultimately culminate in the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD when the Romans have had enough and just come in and sack the city and burn the temple and all of that stuff. The Zealots are heavily involved in that ordeal a few decades after Jesus. But in Jesus' time, the Zealots would have absolutely been the group that was most likely to look at someone who might have been the Messiah and say, if this is Messiah, the very best thing he can do is overthrow Rome. If this is Messiah, the very best thing he can do is tear this whole thing down because this whole thing is corrupt. They would have been pro-violence, pro-overthrow, pro-rebellion, all kinds of things like that. So when the New Testament tells us that one of Jesus' disciples is Simon the Zealot, it's not just Simon the Passionate. Contextually, there's solid evidence to believe that this is someone who comes from a particular kind of group that would have looked at this whole system and said, this whole thing's got to get turned upside down. And Jesus looks at that guy, that Simon, and says, follow me. Now, all of these people, again, none of them would have loved Rome. None of them would have chosen that as their particular outcome. They had different kinds of working relationships here and there and those kinds of things. But oftentimes, nothing unites like a common enemy, right? And if Rome is a common enemy, but in that day and time, like you can't walk down the street and spit on the emperor. Rome's a long way away. There's no interstates, all that good stuff. You can't share a mean Facebook meme about the emperor or anything like that. None of those things are available to you. So if you've got disgruntledness in your heart about Rome and you want to do something about it, the guys who are in charge are a long way away, and it's dangerous to your health to say or do anything in their direction anyway. But what kind of becomes the face of all of this, the face of how people dealt with government and corruption and things they didn't like, and who all four of these groups would have disliked, would have been tax collectors. The Zealots especially. Tax collectors, maybe, I don't know if anyone is here this morning that works for the Internal Revenue Service. Tax collectors still, maybe not anyone's absolute favorite person in the world, right? If you see it on your caller ID, you're like, oh, I've been waiting. I'm so happy that you've reached out to me today. I've got the best hold music and all of that good stuff. None of them would have been like, tax collectors are amazing. But Pharisees and Sadducees, to some degree, would have understood, like, this is part of the game. It's part of the system. But the average, everyday Jewish person living in there would not have cared for a tax collector whatsoever because tax collectors were Jewish people collecting taxes from other Jews that went to Rome. And if you think it's blasphemous to pay taxes to anyone other than God in that system, in that society, in that culture, if that's how you interpret the Old Testament and all that good stuff, a tax collector who is your Jewish brethren occupying that role, taking taxes for you and giving the money to Rome, that would have been the height of blasphemy. And in a sense, that is somebody you can spit on, right? That is a face that you see. That's the face of the empire in the way maybe that's most personal to you. The Zealots believed, or simply refused in many cases, to pay taxes because they thought it was blasphemy. And that was one kind of facet of their rebellion, is saying, I'm not paying any taxes to these guys whatsoever because it's corrupt, they're blasphemous, and tax collectors gain the reputation also of being thieves, right? Of skimming some off the top to keep for themselves, essentially robbing their own people. Jesus calls a zealot to follow him. Funny thing about that, though, who else does Jesus call? Here's Matthew 9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, Jesus told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. Jesus calls zealots and tax collectors, two people who would have looked at the other and said, there's no way this guy is in. There's no way this guy, like, if I'm part of this thing, there's no way this guy also is part of this thing. Zealots would have looked at them as, again, blasphemous, traitorous, corrupt, didn't want anything to do with him, didn't pay their taxes. Tax collectors probably would have looked at zealots as the person most likely to spit in their face and cause trouble for them and their lives. And Jesus calls both a zealot and a tax collector and says, follow me. Now, here's what Jesus doesn't do. Jesus doesn't call Simon the Zealot because he's a huge fan of all of his work, right? He doesn't call Simon the Zealot and say, listen, I want you on my team because all of that insurrection and rebellion and down with the empire and all that stuff, we need more of that, and that's what we're doing, so I need you on my team because I need more zealots. That's not what he does. I mean, as we know, the only violence that Jesus participates in is his own crucifixion. He doesn't call the zealot because he's fully affirming of every choice he ever makes and all of his ways or anything like that. And in the same way, I don't think Jesus calls Matthew, the tax collector, and says, listen, that thing you do skimming off the top, like our funds are a little low too. We need somebody who'll get in there and help us skim off the top and rip off our own people, right? There's no evidence of that taking place, except perhaps Judas, most definitely Iscariot, right? Doing that behavior. He doesn't call a zealot and a tax collector because he affirms all of their ways. Jesus calls them in the same voice he calls us because he believes that both of them can learn to walk in his. Even a zealot, even a tax collector, both together. And he doesn't just call them and then say, follow me, but keep your distance, or follow me, but you stand over here and you stand over here, right? Here's the next verse in Matthew 9. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Jesus, he doesn't just call them, he eats with them. And he doesn't just eat with them anywhere. He eats with them in their house. You know, like them being sinners, which in a sense means, you know, them being us. The Pharisees, who it's important to remember, Jesus also ate with. The Pharisees don't care for this bit at all, right? Eating with someone, eating with them in their homes, this isn't just socializing or talking to. Sharing a meal in someone's home is something more intimate, right? We're getting ready to enter into the season of sharing meals in people's homes. But think about this here on October 22nd and not Thanksgiving Day or Christmas Day. How many meals have you had in someone else's house? How many different houses have you had a meal in so far this year? I bet that number's not very high. Like eating in someone's home, being invited to dinner in someone's home, maybe it's a lost art. But for us, like not just let's meet at Aubrey's, but hey, come to my house and bring your kids and all of that crazy stuff is not really something that it's a very intimate thing. And Jesus walks right into it and says, follow me, and then comes and sits and eat at their house. The Pharisees probably would have been all for Jesus looking at both a zealot and a tax collector and saying, repent. The Pharisees would have been okay with Jesus probably asking anybody to repent other than them. So the Pharisees would have been okay if Jesus talked to tax collectors and talked to zealots, for that matter, in a way of saying, hey, you need to turn and go a different way. Zealots, you're causing too much trouble. You're going to disrupt the delicate balance between Israel and Rome, which is eventually what happens. You're going to cause them to come in and take away everything we have and what power and influence we have. Settle down. And tax collectors, like, we get it. Somebody's got to do it, whatever, but quit skimming off the top for yourself. Don't be so happy about your job, maybe, those kinds of things. The Pharisees would have been happy that Jesus was interacting with them in ways that called them to repentance. And again, Jesus doesn't call them because he affirms all their ways. But what the Pharisees don't get is that Jesus eats with them pre-repentance. Jesus doesn't say, listen, I'd love to come to dinner at your house, but you got to clean up first. You got to make some changes in your life. And then when it's good enough, I'll come eat with you. Jesus meets them where they are and makes himself at home with tax collectors and sinners, which is good because it helps me believe that he'd eat with me too. And not tomorrow, but today. Story goes on to say this. Jesus, of course, hears this. I love how many parts of the Bible say Jesus heard this. He's God. Like, he could hear everything, right? But I like that they always note to say, Jesus heard them. They were talking too loudly. And Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I haven't come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now this too, the Pharisees probably would have agreed with in part, that it's not, the sick need a doctor. Sinners need salvation, that sort of stuff. But the problem, as it always is with the Pharisees, is they remove themselves from that equation. They don't view themselves as in need of the same grace as everyone else. When we talk about who's in need of grace, we mean us too. Jesus will make it clear to the Pharisees throughout that his invitation of grace and forgiveness has a hard time falling on the ears of people who don't believe that they need it. And he's not eating with tax collectors to make them more religious, to make them sacrifice more. He's eating with them so that they might learn and know mercy and the grace of God. As Jesus calls zealots and tax collectors and eats with them in their homes, and Pharisees too, and invites all of these different kinds of people to follow him, to walk in his way. And know that all this comes not through religion first, but through grace. And for us, a group of people, different kinds of people, still seeking to follow that same Jesus today, grace is still our first word. But maybe for Matthew and for Simon, that they would have had an incredibly hard time believing that the other was invited. And I bet that didn't change right away. But I wonder if the place where it changed best was at those dinner tables, where slowly, surely, over one meal, and then another, and then a cup of coffee, and then brunch, and then whatever the case may be. I wonder, slowly, surely, if a zealot and a tax collector, who Jesus both called, would have looked at the other and said, there's no way that guy's getting in. If the place they came together best might have been at these tables, where they might have seen each other more through the eyes of grace and less through the eyes of the sin they believed about the other person. So as we close, I mean, you know where we're going with this, right? Who do we eat with? Chances are it's easier in this world, maybe more than ever, to believe that the distance between us is incredibly wide. But the truth is, Jesus kind of eats with everybody. And not to tell them to sacrifice more, or not to tell them how sick they are, right? The point of all this is not to say, you need to eat with people who are different than you. So go call somebody who's very different than you and invite them to your house and put the meal in front of them and then spend 2 hours telling them how sick they are. That doesn't work. It's bad hospitality, right? He's not doing all this to tell them how sick they are and how much more religion that they need. He's doing it in part to let them know that he's with them. Even the Pharisees who don't see it or want it. He eats with all of these folks. He's there as the grace of God, offering all different kinds of people to follow. Sometimes if we think about who do I eat with and think about sinners, it's easy to make it the same list of prostitutes, tax collectors, these kinds of things. But I think we're at our best when we see ourselves in their stories. Because if Jesus is going to eat with sinners, that means Jesus is going to eat with me. Or sometimes we take this and make it about eating with the hurting, which, again, is amazing and Jesus is for. And the good news about that is, you can do that every Thursday night downtown at Highways and Byways. You can do that every Thursday night right here, where we create space to sit together with people who are walking through all kinds of different things. But more than eating with sinners or eating with people that are hurting, sometimes the most powerful and transformative things we can do are invite a zealot and a tax collector to sit down together. Not to fight or to discuss how sick we perceive the other to be, but to share. Because we're all different kinds of people following the same good news. And we let what we perceive to be the space between the two ends of the spectrum prevent us from meeting anywhere closer to the middle. When's the last time you had a meal with someone who voted with the other guy? And not like, well, my office went out to lunch last week and Bob's a Democrat, so he was there. Does that count? Like, when's the last time on purpose we sat down in a more intimate setting with somebody who doesn't vote the way that we vote? And not to fight or argue, but just to share in that space. When's the last time we did that in our homes? And man, I got miles to go here. Because a lot of days, I don't want to invite anybody over, right? I'm tired. It's a lot of work. But some of our best work takes place around tables. Not to tell each other how sick we are, but to be reminded of the common grace between us. Listen, y'all, I eat with Baptists sometimes, right? Don't tell anybody. I also try on a fairly regular basis to eat with people who don't believe anything at all. And not to be like, all right, this is the third meal we've had together. I'm moving you from point A to point C on my evangelism chart. To be like, if we eat together 7 times, then you'll become a Christian. 7's a biblical number. Maybe that'll be how it works. Like, there's powerful stuff that takes place in intimate spaces around tables. And if Jesus calls a zealot and a tax collector and looks at both of them and says, follow me, I promise you that is a wide enough spectrum for all of us. Jesus calls all kinds of different people, including some who would have looked at each other and said, no, that guy's not getting in, surely. And others who would say that about us. Looks at each of them and says, follow me. And man, often that following, that transformation takes place best around our tables.